Hello, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for staying until my presentation. I know there have been a lot of presentations on AI today, so I really appreciate it. My name is Kevin Lee. I'm an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, and thank you again for coming. Okay, so let's just dive in here. Building on longstanding fears that the rationalization of the world through technology might drain everything human from our lives, scholars have studied how workers and their occupations have been responding. So in particular, this body of scholarship is focused on how workers make space for themselves and their broader occupational communities in the face of advancing technologies. So for instance, a good deal of this scholarship has showed how workers allow for occupational communities emergence, even in the shadow of advancing technologies. Meanwhile, another stream of this scholarship has showed how workers strive to maintain their occupational communities' boundaries against threats like technology. However, in contrary to the thrust of much of this study, there has been some indications that workers have engaged in what I call occupational cannibalization. Specifically, they have created the very technologies intended to carve away at their own occupation's work. This has augured the need, I think, for further study on occupations. So in particular, understanding occupational cannibalization requires looking at how workers weigh what to hold on to and let go about their community. That is, we need to look closely at how workers evaluate the worth of various parts of their community, what they find valuable and worthy enough to retain, as opposed to relinquish to the advance of machines. An extensive literature in sociology has looked at evaluation at the analytical level of societies, how we evaluate different parts of society, how we evaluate each other. And I think we can transpose some of these insights from this literature onto the analytical level of occupations. So to explore these issues, I looked at one particular group of occupational members who were creating an AI that came to threaten their community, namely music composers who were creating an AI to compose music. To get at their lives within their community as developers of the AI, I embedded myself ethnographically for about a year in their startup, which I here call Reverb. And now to get at their broader occupational community, meanwhile, I interviewed 40 composers unaffiliated with the company to flesh out basically the broad cultural toolkit of beliefs that this community held. So this allowed me to compare perspectives within the community compared with those outside of it, allowing me to locate where Reverb's members fit into the community and what more broadly it meant to be a part of the music composition occupational community. I then analyzed these materials using inductive analysis, coding, and then memoing based on these codes to flesh out an emerging analytical framework. I'd like to start by establishing that Reverb's members felt themselves very strongly to be musicians first and foremost. They'd received higher degrees in music and continued working as musicians even while at the company, including as classical music composers, film music composers, and electronic music composers. Moreover, and as in the last sentence of this quote here, they saw themselves as composers primarily. Now, this sense of affiliation to the community undergirded their initial intention to complement composers through their technology. That is, like other composers across the community, they, in considering the boundary between the occupation and machines like AI, generally attempted to protect the community's relationship with its work, given how much they valued this work. Specifically, they sacralized the work of music composition as a vessel for the human soul and expressed their desire to retain this work against the advance of machines. Okay, so first they sacralize the work of music composition as a vessel for the human soul. That is, many both within and outside of Reverb share that music was believed to be a vessel for something rather intimate about the human being writing it. So as one composer unaffiliated with Reverb shared, quote, "You can see into that person's soul a little bit. There's an indescribable human quality. You see that with a lot of our music. You just see someone's most vulnerable ideas and thoughts and feelings just like put out there. It's very raw." In turn, such an expression of inner self and soul through music made for rather powerful and even mystical experiences. For instance, one of Reverb's developers, a composer himself, wrote in a Medium article that he believed that, quote, "great musicians bear their very soul." Take Rostropovich's 1968 London performance of Dvorak's cello concerto. Soviet tanks had rolled into Prague earlier that day, and ironically, this cellist and his orchestra were in fact Soviet, performing a piece by a Czech composer. Rostropovich played with such raw power and emotion that his performance transcended culture and politics and created a bridge between two opposed nations where no other communication had sufficed. And he ends this quote saying, "This is the power of music." Now, given this, company members attempted to retain the community's hold over writing music against the advance of machines. Now, much of this was rooted in community members' worry about what would happen to their music if it were given over to machines, that they might be losing something of its soul. As one composer phrased it, quote, as soon as we began involving machines in composition, as soon as we began incorporating machines into our music, the music became something a little different. We're moving away from magic and into technology, right? We once had magic. This in large part was because composers both at Reverb and across the broader community believed that AI technologies just didn't have it in them to be able to write with soul, not least because they literally had no soul themselves. As another composer said, quote, AI music, obviously it doesn't have a soul. It cannot replicate what's in the soul of a human person. It's like asking for love from a machine. It's just not the same. And then she ends this quote by saying, I feel like robots have no part in music. These sentiments, again, were shared both within and outside the company, informing Reverb's intention to complement composers through the AI that they were developing. However, and as you can probably tell from the beginning of my presentation, this was all not to last. So specifically, composers, the company discovered that composers were not using the technology, though it had been built for them. Instead, video content producers unexpectedly were using the AI. However, these usage patterns threatened composers who wrote stock music. Now, stock music, the stock photos of the music world, often embodied in forms of music like jingles for ads, was historically composed by human composers and bought off the rack by video content producers through online libraries. Thus, given that video content producers were using the AI instead of human composers, Reverb found its technology having consequences at odds with the company's intention to complement rather than substitute for composers. Now, interestingly, though, companies' members' affiliation as composers again undergirded their new intention now to substitute for composers. And let's just get into this just briefly here. What I mean by this is that they, like other composers across the community, were willing to give away work that they valued less. Specifically, they distinguished between the relative soulfulness of forms of work across their community and were willing to relinquish less soulful work across the occupation's boundaries to machines. So first, they distinguish between the soulfulness of different forms of music across the occupation, devaluing stock music as a form of work that lacked soul. So on the one hand, they spoke with great passion and enthusiasm about work they considered more soulful, such as film music. So one composer talked about how he really put a great deal of himself into this music, his soul, while composing it, right? Saying, quote, I'm always trying to find something I love about what I'm working on and who I'm working with. There's a 12-minute film I worked on. It took us like 8 tries to really get this perfect and just think about this music and absorb it, pushing boundaries and being creative. It was beautiful. On the other hand, composers across the community often talked about how unfulfilling stock music was by comparison. Given that it needed to be flexibly used across different kinds of video content, it often needed to follow a very formulaic structure in ways that composers often felt required very little of themselves and their soul. So as one of Reverb's developers, a composer himself noted, quote, let's be honest, from the side of those who create stock music, no one who writes stock music likes writing stock music. Do you listen to the music in ads? He's referring to stock music here. It's not inherently interesting and it's not rewarding at all. So it's perhaps unsurprising then that those at the company and across the community noted that they were willing to relinquish stock music to AI's advance. They were willing to do so in large part because they believed that relinquishing this work to machines would do a lot of good for the community. For instance, they welcomed the notion that getting rid of this work would get rid of composers they felt were not as valuable to the community, namely those who refused to write more soulful music. For instance, the company's CEO, a film composer, justified getting rid of stock composers by basically blaming them for their own demise, saying that they should have written more soulful music instead. Moreover, those within and outside Reverb believed that giving stock music to machines would allow those who only wrote it part-time the time and space to write more soulful music and thus more interesting music instead. As one of Reverb's developers, a composer, well phrased it, quote, in general, we're always trying to automate things so that we can do other things. Even regular people use a calculator to do math quickly. And let's be honest, I'm a fan of scripting things that I don't want to do. So it stands to reason that our product is putting shitty music out of business. The company thus was able to make sense of what its technology was newly intended to do, that is to replace some composers' work. Okay, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit here, and then we can go and talk about all these interesting projects. With regard to occupational communities, which I opened up my presentation with, scholars often have conceptualized occupations as remnants of what we lost in the transition from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. A sense of solidarity wherein members of a given social collective, like an occupation, oftentimes look out for one another. However, as was the case in my study, occupations are not only sites of solidarity, but also of evaluation. Occupation members do not necessarily protect each other from external threats wholesale, but rather also actively ask the question all the time of basically who does good work and who deserves ultimately to be a part of this community. In other words, occupations may be more internally fragmented than we often have imagined them, in ways that may allow for occupation members to cannibalize those parts of their occupation they feel are not up to snuff. In turn, I think some of what I found here demonstrates some of the promise of studying AI in the wild, as is the theme of this session. So we often encounter puzzling phenomena at odds with existing theory. And to be able to make sense of them, we need to go out and see what's actually going on to disentangle how what we see may actually be the case. This can allow us to develop theory grounded in the realities and richness of lived experience, rather than in our speculations of what might be going on. So this approach and its ability to help us disentangle what's been happening to us and our work, I think will only become more important as we face a future ever more dominated by AI technologies. Thank you very much.